All right, Scott, welcome back into Celtics Beat.
Nice to be back with you.
Well, I'm actually going to have to give you the floor. You covered the draft back on Thursday night. I'm letting it go to you. Very general, bland question, but I think there's no other way to start this off. What'd you think about coming out of Thursday night?
Well, it was certainly underwhelming compared to what the buildup was, and you're never quite sure why a lot of these rumors get started on the internet that have so much to do with the Celtics. My always take with it is that a lot of them aren't generated from the Celtics as much as they just make a lot of calls, and they're aggressive. And when, media outlets go looking for stories, other teams will kind of deflect onto the Celtics and say, well, we're not really doing anything, but the Celtics are doing this, and the Celtics are interested in this player, and we hear that the Celtics are interested in moving up in the draft and taking these guys. And we know that they made a lot of calls. Danny Ainge admitted that, he really tried to get up into the top 10, and there was a lot of talk and understanding that he really tried to get up late to that number 9 pick to Charlotte to probably take Justice Winslow. But in the end, Ainge said late Thursday night that the price tag was just too high. They were being asked to really load up on trading lots of picks and a few different established players for one young player who wasn't even at the top of the draft pick. He was at the draft board. He was, closer to number 10. And again, presumably that's Justice Winslow, but there were probably other guys in that mix. Don't know exactly about their interest in Frank Kaminsky or Miles Turner. Seems like a guy who they've been linked to a couple of different times. But in the end, they weren't able to get anything done, and Terry Rozier was the guy that they felt that they were that he was the proverbial best player available at number 16, even though it met with a decidedly disappointed response from the fans.
Yeah, you mentioned Danny Ainge's quotes, and obviously he spoke Friday morning on the radio. He was very blunt about the team trying to move up. If you even recall, during the week, the Celtics used their Twitter handle, for goodness sake. I mentioned the show where they mentioned a Danny Ainge quote about how aggressive the team is going to be. Do you think that they possibly hurt themselves with other teams in negotiations about how obvious they made it seem that they wanted to trade up, and thus probably that's one of the reasons why they could not have got it done, or am I reaching a little bit there?
Well, one of the things you do have to look at in this situation is, and you can be critical of Danny Ainge talking about moving up and then not being able to do it, because presumably you're getting all these assets to eventually do something with them. You don't want to be taking 4 players every year. I don't think they wanted to take 4 players on Thursday night. But you also have to look at it in terms of, well, did some of those other teams in the top 10 move those picks? And the answer is no. Everybody pretty much stayed where they were. If Sacramento traded the 6th pick and you just lost out on that deal, then you can be a little more critical. If Charlotte traded that 9th pick and you just didn't put the right deal forward or didn't, close the deal and they wound up trading it to somebody else, then you could be critical. But if all those teams held on to those picks, how available really were those picks? Now, then you can say, well, what are we doing here? How are we ever going to get these good players if we can't use our assets to trade into the top 10? But the reality was the teams that a lot of people thought might move those picks and that Danny Ainge thought might move those picks wound up falling in love with specific players, whether it be Winslow or Stanley Johnson or Frank Kaminsky or Willie Cauley-Stein at number 6 for Sacramento. And they wound up keeping those picks. And at the end, you can't buy something that's not for sale.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned how it could have very well hurt them in negotiations about how forthright the organization is. In this instance, I think it certainly hurt them with fans because it almost got their expectations all, riled up. And, of course, the Celtics did it themselves. We know the media played their part. I refer to, certain members of the media as arsonists. And, of course, that's not just the media, too, but there are people, on Twitter who have access in their mother's basement, wherever they are, who can just get things rolling. But one of the things, too, that I mentioned that I saw was Brian Scalabrine, who had a claim back on Comcast Sportsnet the other night. And Mike Gorman, I believe, said something along the same lines as well on 98.5 The Sports Hub, that general managers are possibly afraid of now trading with Danny Ainge because they don't want to come out on the wrong side of a deal. Do you think there's anything to that, or is that another reach?
No, I think that's colorfully positive language. And, I respect that, Mike Gorman has a high opinion of Danny Ainge and Brian Scalabrine, on the team broadcast has a high opinion of Danny Ainge. And Danny Ainge has won some of these trades in the past. He clearly won the Brooklyn trade. I don't think Brooklyn would have made that trade, the Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce trade again. If you gave him 100 different chances right now, it might turn out to be one of the worst trades you ever make. Not because they got Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce, but because they didn't win anything with them. They weren't even a very good team with them, and they gave up all their draft picks. So Ainge has clearly won some of these trades. I think he's lost some trades in the past. But I don't think teams were scared of trading with the Boston Celtics. I just don't think that in that situation, you have a team that's in the top 10. They can draft, Justice Winslow. They like Frank Kaminsky. A lot of times in the draft process, over a period of time, you spend so much time looking at these players, analyzing them, bringing them in for workouts, bringing them back for a second workout, that you start to really to then turn around and trade that pick for a bunch of other draft picks in the future or guys that you're not as familiar with. Sometimes you do fall in love with that player, and that was possibly the case. I think it was clearly the case with Celtics and Terry Rozier. This is a guy that a lot of people pegged as going into the 20s at a position where the Celtics were already fairly deep, but they talked to him at the pre-draft combine. They liked him there. They brought him in for one draft workout. I guess you guys are there. They brought him back for another one, and he reinforced some of their thoughts in terms of his competitiveness and his tenacity on the court, and his speed and athleticism. And maybe in a lot of ways they fell in love with that pick instead of going with whoever would have been the highest rated on the board in general terms, whether that be Wisconsin Sam Decker or Bobby Portis out of Arkansas. They went with the player that they had a gut affinity for, and that's why they brought in Terry Rozier. And you probably saw that with a lot of these other teams that were a little bit further up, whether it be Indiana or Miami or Charlotte or Detroit or any of the teams on the way up the top 10.
Yeah, I actually want to get a little more into further detail with you with the draft choice, but I do have just some more questions, on the actual general thought process of what the Celtics were doing. I didn't really mention this in the opening, but I mean, because I still think it's a bit of a reach, on my end, because I actually don't feel this way. But is there any concern that the Celtics had, such an obsession with trading up, that was pretty much their main plan? And when they couldn't get something done, they possibly got burnt in a way and caught off guard and, really almost didn't even know what to do with their selections? Is that, something that could be feasible at all?
I'm not sure about that. I think it had more to do with what I said before. I just think they really like Terry Rozier. And there's other people out there. It's not just, a singular obsession for Brad Stevens, who really, really likes Terry Rozier. And Danny Ainge, who's very high on him after the draft. Of course, what else is he going to say? But still, they seem very enthusiastic about him, regardless of the fact that he's another 6'2" combo guard, which they already have several of. I think it's just a matter of, he was the highest guy they had on the board. They had him higher than they had, Bobby Portis, who's a player that people thought they might take. They had him higher than Sam Decker, who's a player that, a lot of people linked the Celtics to. They had an affinity for the player, and they wound up taking him at 16 rather than think that he might still be there at 28, because, there's a lot of teams, a lot of mock drafts or whatever, what those are worth, had him pegged going somewhere in the 20s. So, you don't want to take the chance that the player that you had an inkling on, and they've had inklings on players in the past, going back to Rajon Rondo, and Avery Bradley was a player that they really liked, who was, maybe went a little bit higher than some people thought he was going to. They really like Terry Rozier, and again, there's a lot of, as much as Celtics fans were disappointed because it's a guard and it wasn't a high-profile player, you read some of these analysis, and some people think that that's going to wind up being, outside of the top 10 or 11 picks, that's going to wind up being one of the gems of the first round.
Yeah, you talked about the negativity that has come out from the draft, and I actually think a lot of it is based around the Rozier pick, and I mentioned it in the opening as well. I actually thought the perceptions were ruined by not trading up and the selection of so-called reaching for the Louisville guard. I mean, I even mentioned, hey, what if they just picked R.J. Hunter at 16, sold the rest of the draft choices, be it 28, 33, and I think 45 was the other one, just came out with R.J. Hunter. I think a lot of people would just say, hey, wasn't that bad of a draft. They couldn't get something done. It isn't great, it isn't bad. But I think the Rozier pick just left such a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, be it in the media or other portions of the fan base. And I think that's where all this air of negativity is coming around. Am I wrong in that aspect there, Scott?
Yeah, I think that's a good point because, again, there was so much anticipation going into the draft. that I think you're right. There's a perception the Celtics got stuck with Terry Rozier, as opposed to this was a player that they targeted that, if they had been able to move up to number 9, they wouldn't have taken Terry Rozier at number 9. They would have probably taken Justice Winslow at number 9. They weren't, I don't know whether they would have taken Willie Cauley-Stein, but, there was some thought that he was going to fall. He didn't fall. He went number 6. They never had a shot at Willie Cauley-Stein. You can't really blame them for not being able to get all the way up to a player they never really had a chance to get. I think you're right. I think that's where it comes from. People had this idea, and fans had this idea that they wanted to do all these things. They failed at doing the things they really wanted to do, and then they wound up throwing a dart at a dartboard and coming up with Terry Rozier as opposed to, coming up with a player that, as I said, they like. They like his ability to attack the basket. In a way, I think they see a future era of the NBA, kind of a changing of the guard in the NBA, literally changing of the guard, where it's much more guard-oriented. We saw that with Golden State. We saw that a lot with Atlanta. Jeff Teague, a big star for Atlanta this year. I think they see a little bit of Rozier there. And then if you look at the rest of the draft, I think you're right there, too, that, R.J. Hunter's a player that, maybe if you had switched Hunter and Rozier and you had taken Hunter at 16 and Rozier at 28, would this have looked a lot better just because, Hunter has a viable commodity, long-distance shot that clearly the Celtics need and want, and that people can identify with as being like, okay, at least we got our three-point guy. It would have been better to get Devin Booker. But if he wasn't there, R.J. Hunter's the next best available. If you just put those two, I don't think people would have been dancing in the streets because people wanted a top 5, top 6 pick. They wanted maybe an inside guy. Maybe they wanted to trade all the picks for a veteran. But maybe it looks better there. And number 33, Jordan Mickey, is that shot blocker that they were looking for. Now, how much a 6'8" shot blocker from LSU translates to the NBA? He's not exactly, a 7'2" guy, but Serge Ibaka, I think, is only about 6'9", and he's an outstanding shot blocker. They're high on him being available. So I think if you look at the massive talent they got, pretty good for the top 33 picks. But it was just anticipation was that so many other things were going to be happening that it just seems like kind of a consolation prize at this point.
I want you to hold those thoughts there on Hunter and Mick. We got to take a quick commercial break. We'll be back here with Scott Souza here on Celtics Beat on CLNS Radio. Okay, welcome back on into Celtics Beat. We got Scott Souza here of the MetroWest Daily News. Scott, you were just talking about R.J. Hunter there. Obviously, that was a player that fans were actually pretty happy they selected. That many people feel it is the steal of the draft. Am I expecting too much here? I actually personally think that, pending him being on the roster, of course, he's someone who could contribute right away next season, largely because he fills such a glaring need. Am I wrong there?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think Brad Stevens wants to, be able to space the floor. And we saw this last year. He wasn't really able to do it with Rajon Rondo on the team. He was able to do it a little bit with Jeff Green on the team, but he freelanced a lot, and things broke down when the ball got into Jeff Green's hands a lot. But when they went on that run the second half of the year, when they went 24-12, this is not a small sample size. People discount the Celtics' second half run. It wasn't like it was 2 weeks long. It was half the season, 36 games. They were the second best team in the Eastern Conference. You can say they didn't play off in the playoffs, which you're right, they lost all 4 games they played. But they were a very good team the second half of last season. They were playing a system where a lot of guys were taking three-pointers and had to take three-pointers. Jay Crowder was taking three-pointers. Evan Turner was taking three-pointers. Obviously, Marcus Smart, Avery Bradley taking a lot of three-pointers. In that system with Brad Stevens, you're going to be taking a lot of three-pointers, and you want guys to be able to knock them down. And R.J. Hunter, outside of Devin Booker, most people consider him the best career shooter in the draft. And, again, it may have been a reach 16, but the guys you got at 28 and 33 were guys that maybe you don't think you were in the mix at 16, but if you had been picking 20, 21, I think you would have been happy with both those guys.
And it's interesting, too, that I've noticed about shooters coming in the draft. A lot of them are picked late in the draft. Steve Kerr, I believe, was a late selection, if he was even drafted at all. Remember Kyle Korver coming into the NBA. I was a huge fan of his coming out of Creighton. He was a second-round draft choice. I think, the worst career that I can think of these, just shooting specializers, if I want to use that. I don't even think that's a word. But they all seem to work out in some aspect or another, and that's why I think R.J. Hunter was such a safe pick at 28, and I actually do expect contributions from him, largely because I'm using historical examples as reason why.
Yeah, and the reason why some of those guys don't go higher, and Steph Curry may change that because Steph Curry is such a good shooter. He slipped to number 7 because he was a point guard who shot. He wasn't incredibly explosive point guard. There were some questions about his defensive ability coming out of Davidson. Wasn't a huge school, kind of like R.J. Hunter with Georgia State. But, you know, you always want that style tool, all-star type player, to use a baseball term. You want the guy who can attack the basket, rebound, who can score, who can, another kind of buzzword for the NBA for years was a guy who can create his own shot. And that was kind of a thought of how college shooting specialists don't always translate to the NBA because they can't create their own shot as much. They're catch and shoot guys. Well, that goes back a little bit more towards the kind of the isolation basketball a few years ago where, you know, you get the ball guarded one-on-one and you had to create space for yourself. You don't see that as much in the NBA. The NBA is pick and roll. The NBA is pick and pop. The NBA is especially when you look at teams like Atlanta and Golden State and the Boston Celtics under Brad Stevens, it's ball movement to get to an open spot of the floor. It's stretching the floor. And guys who, you need three-point shooters. Everybody wants three-point shooters. And guys who can catch and get their shot up quickly. That don't need a huge wind-up for a shot, but have a quick release, and Hunter does. And then can also, you know, if there is a closeout, can maybe put the ball on the floor a little bit and get to the basket or pass, which Hunter can also do. Those guys are much more valuable. I just think in years past, it was thought, well, shooting is kind of one skill that, you know, you want a really well-rounded player. If you're picking top 10, top 12, you want size. And I think there's a little bit less emphasis on size now. And maybe you can always pick up some guy who's going to sit in the corner and shoot threes. Well, now everybody sits in the corner and shoot threes, and you need guys who do it really well, especially if you're going to play like the Celtics. And Hunter has been a guy, he did not have great percentages last year, but you saw, you know, what he did in the tournament beating Baylor. And you obviously see from watching him the range that he has, that he could be one of those guys who, you know, has a long career in the NBA and can hit some big shots for you.
Yeah, just as long as, too, they play a little defense. That's all that really matters, and they can pretty much see the floor for as long as they want and on almost any team in the NBA. Briefly, just to sort of wrap the sort of draft discussion up in one way, I mean, Jordan Mickey and also Marcus Thornton, is there a good chance that either of those guys probably won't even be on the team by training camp or even coming out of the team at training camp, as they were just second-round draft choices and their contracts aren't guaranteed?
I'm not sure about Marcus Thornton. I think Jordan Mickey will be here. I mean, Danny Ainge last night called him our most athletic front court player right now. So he's stepping into those shoes. It's not saying a ton, considering the rest of the front court is Jared Sullinger and Kelly Olynyk and Tyler Zeller, who have other skills, but they're not exactly considered, five-star athletes. But, you know, he did lead the Division I in block shots last year, 3.64. He's a guy who can be a very versatile defensive player. He's very, you know, these are kind of draft buzzwords, but he's very long. He has a wingspan, so he can recover. He has a great first step. I'm not sure why he was available in that early second round. And, you know, I think he's not necessarily going to be a star, but he's a player who I think could come in a small ball lineup, maybe even play some five, but certainly play some four and play some active defense. And that's something that, you know, they need. They need an active defensive player out there who can kind of get out on the perimeter on a switch and make some plays with a block shot and start some breaks. It's kind of interesting where he got picked in terms of that early second-round pick, and that's been a position that has churned out players over the years. Draymond Green was in that range for Golden State. Jay Crowder, a player of the Celtics, are almost assuredly going to re-sign as a restricted free agent, was in that early second-round area there. And then you go back even a few years, not a player the Celtics took, but a player that Jordan Mickey could wind up replacing here in Boston. You know, Brandon Bass was that early second-round pick. Those guys have been shown to be able to be contributors in the NBA, and it actually can be a bit of a sweet spot because you have a little more contract flexibility with them in picking them early in the second round as opposed to being stuck with that guaranteed contract for somebody like R.J. Hunter who you pick at the end of the first round. Not sure about Marcus Thornton. You know, obviously they like him a bit or they wouldn't have drafted him, but you know, adding yet another guard to that mix when you already took two earlier in the draft, you know, maybe they can, you know, find a situation where they can designate him to Maine or maybe play him overseas. I'm not sure exactly what he's going to want to do. He did come in for a draft workout, so he must have impressed them a little bit. But it could be a stretch to keep all four of them. But I'm pretty sure they're going to keep, unless there's some type of a trade in the next few weeks, they're going to keep all three of the top 33 picks.
Yeah, and if you want to mention about early second rounders, you can throw the Wayback Machine, go about 15 years back. Gilbert Arenas was another early second round draft choice, if my memory serves me correctly. And you mentioned, obviously, the 4 players, and obviously 2 in the second round. How long do you expect some of these draftees here to go unsigned? Because that will obviously offer Ainge a little flexibility to move these guys possibly over the summer if it comes down to that.
Yeah, I mean, the first round picks usually sign pretty quickly. The second round picks can take a little bit longer. A lot of times with those, they'll play in the summer league even though they're not re-signed. The Celtics have a couple of summer leagues coming up. They've got Utah, followed by Las Vegas, so they got 2 summer leagues back-to-back, and they're going to want all these guys in there. That'll give you some flexibility, but the thing is with these, once the second round picks sign, they sign very team-friendly contracts. They sign these contracts for about, 400 feet. Glenn Davis, by the way, another example of an early second round pick right in that range from LSU that contributed, still contributes in the NBA and contributed to the Celtics for a while. So maybe it's just an LSU thing for those guys to go at the top of the second round. But, those contracts they have ice in them. I mean, you see a guy like Phil Pressey who signs a contract, and there are, you've got deadlines to spread out all the time. June 1st, December 1st, where the Celtics can kind of get out of that contract, and they kept bringing him back. I don't know whether he's going to be on the team next year with all the guys they trade for, but once you sign them, they become salary cap pieces too, where you can move them as well. I don't know if you can move them. I think there might be a moratorium in terms of once you sign them, you can't trade them for 6 months.
Yeah, it expires in December.
I don't think there's any huge drawback in bringing them in. And the Celtics, if they're looking to trade, again, if those guys had incredible value, they would not have gone in the second round. So it's not like there's going to be a huge demand that's built up for Marcus Thornton or trade Mickey over the next couple of weeks. They have to show something first. I guess they exploded in summer league, perhaps. But, they have, if they want to make trades, they've got plenty of pieces to make trades. They've got contracts they can trade. They have trade exceptions they can trade. They have, I won't say fake contract, but that dubious contract that Chris Babb signed at the end of the year for $900,000 of money he'll never see. That's a non-guaranteed money. They can throw that in. So if they have to match salaries in a salary cap situation or put somebody into somebody else's salary cap situation, they can do that with relative ease.
I think that's sort of a good way to transition to some off-season discussion, because before we get you out of here, I think we obviously have to talk about now. The coming 2 to 3 weeks is going to be obviously fairly hectic no matter what. Of course, obviously fairly hectic for you as you're on the Celtics beat. Once again, I started off this conversation with a bland, open-ended question. I'm going to start off this portion of the discussion with a pretty bland, open-ended discussion. We know the Celtics are going to be pretty aggressive here in free agency. In your mind, would you care to rank their top free agents priorities, say 1 to 3 to 5?
In terms of free agents, again, you got to know exactly who's going to be available. There's some question of whether DeAndre Jordan's going to be available. I think he's a guy that they could really look at in terms of filling that need up front. You would think that the Clippers would want him back, but there was some talk that he wasn't getting along very well with Chris Paul and that he might be out there. I think LaMarcus Aldridge is a bit of a pipe dream. It seems like he's not going to go back to Portland. He may consider Boston, but chances are he's going to want to, there seems to be a big feeling that it's going to be Los Angeles or the Spurs for him. I think they're going to take another run at Kevin Love. I don't know whether, Kevin Love is ultimately going to go back to Cleveland, but if he feels that Cleveland doesn't want him as much as maybe he wants to go back there and give it a shot, maybe they don't want him. Maybe, LeBron James gets in the year of management and says, he's not what we thought he was, and we're better off, just finding big shooters and going with Tristan Thompson up front, and they're going to have to pay Tristan Thompson. I think Kevin Love is a player that they're going to go strong at, and Greg Monroe is another guy who I think you're going to see them go after, because he's a player that things did not work out well there in Detroit. He's really looking at other directions. You have Marc Gasol, but there's a feeling that Marc Gasol will ultimately go back to Memphis. I would say in terms of guys out there, in terms of the front court, which Danny Ainge said last night will be a focus of free agency because they did draft so many guys, you could be looking at Monroe and Jordan if he's available as targets for the Celtics.
Yeah, I like to think that Monroe is becoming more and more of a possibility here. We had Gary Wolf on last week, and he basically said outright it's going to be New York or Boston. News came out earlier this week from Jared Zwerling at Bleacher Report, who basically says that he expects that David West is going to New York. If that happens, wouldn't that, use process of elimination, turn Greg Mudd, who is represented by David Falk. We know Danny Ainge and David Falk have a very good relationship. I think there's a lot to it there, but at the same time, I could see maybe the Celtics being a little more aggressive possibly for Kevin Love, of course. But if that avenue doesn't work out, maybe then they probably do reach, go to Greg Monroe, and I'd like to think there's a good possibility there with him.
Yeah, I mean, he's a talented offensive player. The question with him, I guess, is kind of, for the amount of money that you're going to pay him, how much is he really an upgrade over Jared Sullinger? Greg Monroe had a good year last year. He averaged 15 and 10, which sounds good, but he's not an above-the-rim player. And Jared Sullinger, before he got hurt, was having a year that some people would have considered not living up to expectation, and he was 14 and 9. So the stats there were actually fairly close, and Jared Sullinger is a guy who you have at much cheaper dollars and you're familiar with. So, again, Greg Monroe, I think, would be a nice addition to this team. He's obviously a talented inside offensive player, but he's not a shot blocker, and he's a player who's going to cost you a lot of money.
Yeah, but obviously I thought a very key phrase you mentioned regarding Jared Sullinger was before he got hurt. Greg Monroe, since he's been in the league, has played pretty much 80 games every single year. I actually think Monroe would be, a decent upgrade over Sullinger, if for no other reason. You could pretty much count on him for 80 games. And yes, he certainly has a deficiency defensively, but I think that's probably where maybe the Celtics do open up some possibilities for a trade. I don't know how realistic Nerlens Noel is. It sounds like Roy Hibbert's on the block as well, but I just think almost too that they have to spend money this year. I think they can shoot for these guys like Kevin Love, but if Greg Monroe's out there at a max price, I just don't see how you just don't sign up for that, straight away.
Yeah, and that's also, and again, you look, unless the guy's a total bust, you can also move him later. The one thing you have to be a little bit careful of is the Detroit Pistons scenario from a few years ago, where they put themselves in position to have the salary cap room, and then nobody wanted to go there. So they wound up signing Ben Gordon, wound up signing Charlie Villanueva. They wound up overpaying average players with huge, huge contracts, and then suddenly they were out of salary cap room, and they weren't any better than they were before. So, you do have the money. You have created expectations that eventually you will spend it, that you will trade some of these assets for somebody, and maybe they trade, instead of signing a free agent, I don't know who this player would be, but they trade assets to bring in a player who's already, some may view as being overpaid, but he's a player that for whatever reason isn't working out for one of these teams, almost a la the Ray Allen situation from 2007, where it's just a guy, that team, Ray Allen was still a highly productive player who still, when he came here, you saw how much he still had left in the tank, but he was just a player that Seattle/Oklahoma City was looking to move on in a different direction at the time. They didn't want to pay, they didn't want to be hamstrung with $20 million in Ray Allen, so he was available for that situation. And I think that that's where the Celtics have wanted, and Danny Ainge has wanted to put himself in position to pounce when that situation's available. Now, those don't come along very often. The James Harden situation doesn't come along very often. The Kevin Love situation doesn't come along very often. But Danny Ainge wants to always be in that conversation. If a guy like one of those guys, or even a DeMarcus Cousins, if that guy becomes available, he wants to have the assets and the financial flexibility to be able to make a pitch for that guy.
Yeah, and one thing I think that we've also noticed here to wrap this up is now recently a lot of teams, they actually want players who are proven in some aspect. And you mentioned that, signing Monroe would give you flexibility. 2-3 years from now, you could possibly trade Monroe to, get maybe that next James Harden or Kevin Love type of trade. We've seen in recent years, or in recent months for that matter, at least from what that's been reported out there, is that you just can't dump all the draft choices on a team and say, hey, yeah, that's good enough, give us your star. A lot of these teams, they actually want a proven player. So in a way, I would hope that Monroe would be that guy. But Scott, great chat. Great to get you out of here on that. Scott Souza, MetroWest Daily News. You can follow Scott on Twitter at Scott_Souza. Scott, thanks so much for stopping by Celtics Beat once again.
Thanks a lot for having me on. Look forward to doing it again soon.
We will. All right, we'll be back with a brief road to wrap up around the NBA in 5. All right, thanks, Scott. I appreciate that so much. Show airs on Sunday, so we'll shoot it out to you then. And thanks so much for being very flexible with me, of course. And obviously, thanks again for the time.
Sounds good. Good luck with the editing.
Thanks. See you later.
Take care.
Bye.